The most dangerous people are never the ones you see coming. Berlin, late autumn, 1944, the rain did not fall hard, it settled, a thin mist clinging to cobblestones and uniforms alike, turning the city into something quieter, something watchful. Captain James Whittaker stood beneath a flickering street lamp on Friedrichstrasse, his gloved hand resting lightly against the cold metal of his watch, counting seconds, not out of habit, but control. Across the street, civilians moved in careful patterns, heads down, footsteps measured, no one lingered, no one spoke unless necessary, or had taught them efficiency, and silence, and then she appeared, not suddenly, not dramatically, just there, emerging from the gray like she had always belonged to it, a woman in her mid-twenties, modest coat, hair tucked away, nothing remarkable except for the limp, subtle, but undeniable, her right foot dragging half an inch behind the left, each step deliberate, each movement controlled. Whittaker watched her cross 20 yards of open street without looking up once. Not at the soldiers, not at the checkpoints, not at him. Most people glanced, even for a second, instinct, fear, curiosity, but she did not, and that absence, that perfect absence, settled into his mind like a question he could not ignore. He checked his watch again, 7:14 p.m., she passed directly under the lamp, light brushing her face for less than a second, pale, composed, unreadable, and then she was gone. Swallowed by the narrow alley beyond, Whittaker did not move immediately, he let the moment sit, let the silence stretch, because experience had taught him that truth revealed itself in what did not happen. She did not hesitate, she did not scan her surroundings, she did not adjust her pace when soldiers passed within 10 feet, and yet, nothing about her felt careless, it felt measured, precise, as if every step had been decided long before she took it. 10 seconds later, Whittaker stepped off the curb, crossing the street with the same calm rhythm he had practiced for years. His boots made no unnecessary sound, his posture unchanged, just another officer moving through a tired city, but his eyes followed the line of her path, 20 yards, then 30, into the alley where the light thinned and the air held a faint smell of damp stone and coal smoke. She was still there, halfway down, her figure smaller now, the limp still present, consistent, almost too consistent. Whittaker slowed slightly, not enough to draw attention, just enough to observe, because something in the pattern did not align. Injuries fluctuate, fatigue alters movement, but hers did not. It remained exact, step after step, like a metronome, like a signal, and then it happened, small enough that anyone else would have missed it. Her foot touched the ground, steady, even. No drag, no hesitation, just one clean step, and then the limp returned. Precise as before. Whittaker stopped, not physically, but internally, the kind of stillness that comes when a piece of the world shifts out of place, because in that single step, the entire illusion unraveled, and for the first time, he did not see a wounded civilian, he saw intention, and intention meant purpose, and purpose, in a city like this, meant something far more dangerous than any weapon he carried. Whittaker did not follow immediately, not because he hesitated, but because timing mattered more than speed. He remained where he was for exactly 5 seconds, long enough for distance to feel natural, short enough to keep her within reach. Then he stepped forward into the alley, the sound of his boots softened by damp stone, the air cooler here, quieter, as if the city itself was holding its breath. She continued ahead, the same measured rhythm, the same careful imperfection in her stride. But now he watched differently, no longer seeing a flaw, but a pattern. 30 feet ahead, she passed a narrow doorway, unmarked, easy to miss. Her hand brushed briefly against the frame, not stopping, not even slowing, just a touch, light as a thought. Whittaker noticed the detail and stored it without reaction, because details were currency in his line of work, and she was spending them deliberately. He adjusted his pace by half a step, closing the distance without urgency. The alley stretched another 50 yards before opening into a small service courtyard, dim light spilling from a single overhead bulb, crates stacked along one wall, a delivery cart left unattended, ordinary, forgettable, the kind of place no one remembered passing through. She entered without pause, her limp unchanged, her posture steady. Whittaker followed, stopping just at the edge, remaining partially in shadow. He did not call out, did not announce himself, instead he watched. Because observation revealed more than confrontation ever could. She moved to the center of the courtyard, then stopped, the first full stop since he had seen her her shoulders rose slightly with a quiet breath, then lowered, controlled, and in that stillness, something shifted. She straightened, not dramatically, just enough to remove the illusion of fragility, her weight balanced evenly for a fraction of a second, both feet firm, aligned, and then, as if remembering the role she had chosen, the limp returned. Precise, deliberate, Whitaker felt the certainty settle in his chest, not excitement, not surprise, just clarity. She knew she was being followed, not guessed, not suspected, known, because no one maintained a performance that exact without an audience in mind, and the realization carried a second layer, heavier, quieter. She had not tried to lose him, she had led him here. The courtyard remained silent, the distant hum of the city barely reaching its edges. She turned then, slowly. Not startled, not defensive, just aware. Her eyes met his across the 20 feet of open space, and for a moment neither of them moved. There was no fear in her expression, no urgency, only a kind of calm recognition, as if this moment had been part of the design from the beginning. Whitaker stepped fully into the light, his posture relaxed, his hands visible, not as a gesture of trust, but of control. He studied her face now without obstruction, the pale skin, the steady gaze, the absence of anything unnecessary. She was not pretending anymore, not entirely. The limp remained, but the rest of her had shifted, sharpened, and in that quiet exchange, Whitaker understood something that changed the shape of the situation completely. This was not a pursuit, it was an introduction, and he was not the one who had initiated it. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the kind of silence that did not feel empty, but precise, like something measured down to the second. Whitaker let it hold, because breaking it too early would mean losing whatever she had intended to reveal. The overhead light flickered once, casting a brief shadow across her face, and when it steadied again, she was still watching him, not with defiance, not with fear, but with an almost clinical attention, as if she were studying him the same way he had studied her. "You noticed," she said finally, her English careful, controlled, touched with a faint accent. That did not hide where she came from. Whitaker did not answer immediately. He shifted his weight slightly, the sound of leather against stone barely audible. "Enough," he replied, his voice even, not confrontational, not inviting, just present. Her gaze softened by a fraction, not warmth, but acknowledgement. "Most do not," she said, and the words carried no pride, only fact. She took a step forward, the limp returning with perfect consistency, half an inch of delay, nothing more, nothing less. Whitaker's eyes followed the movement, not the act, but the precision behind it. "You dropped something back there," he said, reaching into his coat but not yet revealing the folded paper. She stopped again, 10 feet between them now, the distance deliberate, chosen. "You picked it up," she replied, not a question. He let the paper remain where it was, because this was no longer about evidence, it was about understanding. "You wanted me to," he said, and for the first time, a faint shift crossed her expression, not surprise, but confirmation. "Yes," she answered, simple, direct. The courtyard seemed smaller now, the air tighter, as if the space itself had adjusted to the weight of the exchange. Whitaker studied her more closely, the steadiness of her breathing, the absence of unnecessary movement, everything about her was reduced to function, to intention. "Why?" he asked, not sharply, not accusing, just the question that mattered most. She tilted her head slightly, considering him, or perhaps measuring what he was capable of hearing. "Because you do not rush," she said, "because you do not react, because you wait," each phrase placed carefully, like steps in a pattern, and Whitaker understood that she had been watching him longer than he had been watching her. The realization did not unsettle him, it clarified the situation further. This was not chance, this was selection. The paper in his pocket felt heavier now, not because of what was written on it, but because of what it represented. A line drawn between two people who understood something others did not. "You are not afraid of being followed," he said. She shook her head once, small, controlled. "No," she answered, then added after a brief pause, "I am careful about who follows me." The distinction settled between them, quiet but undeniable. Whitaker took a slow breath, the kind that marked a decision rather than a reaction, and in that moment, he realized the balance of power had shifted in a way that did not rely on rank or uniform. She had created the situation, but he was still here, still choosing to stay, and that choice, more than anything else, was what she had been testing all along. Whitaker did not move, not because he was uncertain, but because movement would have broken the balance that had just formed between them. The paper remained in his pocket, untouched, its presence now secondary to the conversation. Unfolding in the quiet space between two people who understood restraint, the overhead light hummed softly, a low electric sound that filled the gaps between their words. "You chose this place," he said after a moment, his voice steady, neutral. She gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible. "It is quiet here," she replied, then added, "People do not listen when nothing happens." Whitaker let that settle. The idea that absence itself could be a kind of cover. He glanced briefly toward the alley behind him, still empty, still undisturbed, then back to her. "And the message," he said, finally drawing the folded paper from his coat, holding it between two fingers, not as evidence, but as acknowledgement. She looked at it without reaching, without any visible reaction. "It was never for the ones who read it," she said, her tone unchanged, as if the meaning should already be clear. Whitaker studied her face again, searching not for deception, but for the shape of her intent. "Then it was for me," he said, and this time, she did not nod, she did not confirm, but the silence that followed carried the answer more clearly than any word. The courtyard felt smaller again, the space narrowing as the conversation moved closer to something neither of them had yet defined. Whitaker lowered his hand slightly, the paper still visible. "Why?" he asked again, but now the question held a different weight, not suspicion, but curiosity sharpened by understanding. She took another step forward, the limp, precise, controlled, closing the distance to less than 8 feet, close enough that he could see the faint lines of fatigue beneath her eyes, the kind that did not come from a single night, but from a long accumulation of careful decisions. "Because the war is loud," she said quietly, "and loud things hide poorly." Whitaker listened without interruption. Her voice did not rise, did not fall, it remained steady, like everything else about her. "People who act quickly make mistakes," she continued, "and people who believe they are right stop paying attention." She paused then, just long enough for the words to settle. "But you," she said, meeting his eyes directly, "you wait, you notice what does not fit." Whitaker felt the truth of that statement not as praise, but as recognition, and recognition, in this context, meant exposure. He slipped the paper back into his coat, not to hide it, but to remove it from the center of the exchange. "And what happens now?" he asked. She held his gaze for a moment longer, then shifted her attention slightly, not away, but past him, as if measuring something beyond the immediate space. "That depends," she said, her voice softer now, but no less controlled, "on whether you believe what you were taught, or what you have seen." The distinction lingered between them, subtle, but decisive. Whitaker did not answer right away, because the question was not simple, and she knew it. That was why she had asked it, not to hear his response, but to see how long he would take to consider it. And in that pause, in that measured silence, the balance shifted again, not toward her, not toward him, but toward something far more uncertain, a line neither of them had crossed yet, but both clearly understood was there. Whitaker did not answer her question immediately, not because he did not understand it, but because he understood it too well. The difference between what a man is told and what he chooses to believe is not measured in words, it is measured in consequences, and consequences in a place like this did not arrive loudly, they arrived quietly, and stayed. The overhead light flickered again, softer this time, as if even the electricity was uncertain how long it should remain. He shifted his gaze briefly to the edge of the courtyard. The stacked crates, the unattended cart, every object exactly where it had been, unchanged, but no longer neutral. Everything now felt like part of a design he had stepped into without realizing. He exhaled slowly, then looked back at her. "I believe what I can verify," he said, his tone even, controlled. Her eyes did not change, but something in her posture settled, not relief, not approval, just alignment. "Then you are already different," she replied, and Whitaker recognized the statement for what it was, not flattery, not manipulation, but classification. She was placing him somewhere, assigning him a role within a structure he had not yet fully seen. He took a small step forward, reducing the distance to less than 6 feet, not an act of pressure, but of presence. "And you?" he asked. "What do you believe?" The question lingered for a moment before she answered. Not because she hesitated, but because she chose the exact shape of her response. "I believe patterns," she said quietly, "people, systems, expectations, they all repeat, and repetition creates blindness." Whitaker listened, not interrupting, because he recognized the rhythm in her words, the same precision she carried in movement, in silence, now carried in thought. When something breaks the pattern, she continued, most people look away, they correct it, they ignore it, they return to what is familiar. She paused, her gaze steady on his, but a few people do not. Whitaker felt the weight of that distinction settle again, not as a compliment, but as a responsibility. He considered the alley behind him, the city beyond it, miles of controlled movement, regulated behavior, predictable fear, and then this moment, this interruption, placed exactly where it would be noticed by someone willing to see it. You created the break, he said, and she gave the smallest nod, yes, the word simple, but carrying the full acknowledgement of intent. The air between them felt sharper now, not tense, but defined, as if the conversation had moved beyond uncertainty into something more deliberate. Whitaker reached into his coat again, not for the paper, but for something else, his watch. He glanced at it briefly, 7:22 p.m., time moving forward whether decisions were made or not. He closed it with a soft click, then looked back at her. And if I had not followed, he asked. She did not answer. Immediately this time, her gaze shifted slightly, not away, but inward, as if considering a possibility that had already been accounted for. Then someone else would have, she said, calm, certain. Whitaker held her eyes for a moment longer, understanding settling in layers. This was never about chance, never about a single outcome, it was about selection within a system of possibilities, and he had been chosen, not because he was the only one capable, but because he was the one most likely to see. The realization did not feel like control, it felt like alignment with something larger than a single decision. And as the silence returned, quieter now, more deliberate, Whitaker understood that whatever came next would not be defined by orders or protocol, but by whether he was willing to step beyond them, even slightly. Even once Whitaker did not step back, but he did not step closer either. The space between them remained deliberate, measured, as if crossing it too soon would collapse something that had taken careful design to construct. The distant sound of a truck echoed faintly through the alley beyond, then faded, leaving the courtyard sealed again in its quiet isolation. He studied her once more, not as a subject, but as a system, every detail aligned, every movement intentional, and for the first time, he allowed himself to consider not just what she was doing, but what she was avoiding. You are not carrying anything, he said, his voice low, observational. She did not glance down, did not check her coat. She already knew what he meant. No papers, no bag, nothing visible, and yet a message had been delivered, a signal placed exactly where it needed to be found. I do not carry what can be taken, she replied, her tone unchanged. Whitaker nodded once, not agreement, but acknowledgement of the principle, the kind of rule that did not appear in manuals but defined survival all the same. Then, where does it go? He asked. She held his gaze, steady, unbroken. It moves, she said, and for a brief moment, the answer seemed incomplete, almost abstract, until the meaning settled beneath it. Not an object, not a thing, but a sequence, a chain of small, controlled actions, each one passing unnoticed unless someone chose to see them together. Whitaker felt the structure forming in his mind, not fully visible, but present enough to recognize, the doorway, the touch, the paper, the timing, all connected, all precise, and none of it dependent on a single point of failure. You built redundancy into silence, he said quietly. She did not respond with words, but the faint shift in her expression confirmed it. Not pride, not satisfaction, just recognition that he understood. The courtyard seemed to narrow further, not physically, but perceptually, as if everything outside of this exchange had become irrelevant. Whitaker reached into his coat again, this time retrieving the folded paper. He held it up between them, not as a threat, not as leverage, but as a question that no longer needed to be asked directly. She looked at it for a moment, then back at him. You have not opened it, she said, and it was not a guess. He shook his head once. No, he replied. The decision had not been hesitation, it had been discipline, and discipline, in this moment, mattered more than information. She studied him for a second longer, then gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible. Good, she said, the word quiet, but waited. Whitaker felt the implication settle immediately. Whatever was inside the paper was not meant for him in the way most information was. It was meant to test whether he would act before understanding, or understand before acting. And in choosing not to open it, he had already answered a question she had not spoken aloud. He lowered the paper slightly, keeping it visible but no longer central, and now, he said, the question simple, but carrying everything that had led to this point, she took one final step forward, closing the distance to less than 4 feet, close enough that the illusion of the limp became irrelevant, close enough that the performance no longer mattered. Now, she repeated softly, her eyes steady on his. Now you decide if you were following me, or if you were meant to find me. The distinction settled between them, sharper than anything before, because one implied control, the other implied intention beyond his own. Whitaker did not look away, did not break the moment, because he understood that whatever answer he gave, even in silence, would not just define what happened next, it would define which side of the pattern he now stood on. Whitaker did not answer her question with words, because words would have reduced it to something smaller than it was. Instead he held her gaze, steady, unbroken, and in that silence he made the only decision that mattered. He did not step away. The overhead light flickered again, a soft pulse that briefly dimmed the space before returning, and in that momentary shadow, something in her expression shifted, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough for him to recognize it as confirmation. Not of trust, but of alignment. You already know, she said quietly, and Whitaker understood that she was not asking for an answer, she was acknowledging one. The distinction settled between them with the same precision as everything else she had done. He slipped the folded paper back into his coat, not as concealment, but as acceptance of its role. The information inside it no longer mattered as much as the fact that he had chosen not to look, and that choice, more than any action, had placed him where he now stood. The air in the courtyard felt colder, or perhaps sharper, as if the edges of everything had become more defined. What happens next? He asked, not because he lacked direction, but because he wanted to see how she would frame it. She turned her head slightly, listening for something beyond the walls, the distant city, the faint rhythm of movement that never fully stopped. Then she looked back at him. Now, you leave, she said, the instruction simple, direct. Whitaker did not move, not yet. And the message, he said. She held his gaze, calm, steady. You do nothing with it, she replied, and the words landed with more weight than any command he had received in uniform. Do nothing, he repeated, not as resistance, but as clarification. She gave a small nod, almost imperceptible. Most people act, she said, they report, they deliver, they respond, and in doing so, they reveal themselves. Whitaker felt the structure of her logic settle into place. Action created visibility, visibility created patterns, and patterns, when seen clearly, could be traced. You are asking me to break the chain, he said. She shook her head once. Not asking, she corrected softly, showing you where it is. The distinction was subtle, but absolute. Whitaker exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that marked the transition from observation to participation, because in choosing to do nothing, he would not be stepping away from the situation, he would be stepping into it, just in a way that left no trace, no immediate consequence, and that made it more dangerous than any direct action. He glanced briefly toward the alley, still empty, still silent, then back to her. And if I choose not to, he said. She did not hesitate. Then you were never meant to be here, she replied, her tone unchanged. No threat, no judgment, just fact. Whitaker held that for a moment, the simplicity of it, the absence of pressure, because the decision was entirely his, and yet the outcome had already been accounted for. She took a step back then, the distance widening by a single pace, the limp returning as if a switch had been flipped, the performance re-established with the same precision as before. The shift was immediate, complete, and in that instant, she was no longer the woman standing in front of him. She was once again part of the city, part of the pattern, almost indistinguishable from everything around her. This is the only time we speak like this, she said quietly, and the finality in her voice did not feel dramatic, it felt inevitable. Whitaker nodded once, not agreement, not obedience, but recognition of the boundary she had just drawn. She turned then, without waiting, without hesitation, and began to walk toward the far end of the courtyard, the limp steady, consistent, half an inch of delay with each step. Whitaker watched her go, not following this time, not calling out, because the decision had already been made, not in words, but in the fact that he remained exactly where he was, and did nothing at all. Whitaker remained in the courtyard long after her footsteps faded, not because he was unsure, but because leaving too soon would have meant reacting, and reaction was exactly what she had warned against. The overhead light steadied now, its faint hum constant, almost indifferent. He reached into his coat and felt the folded paper again, still there, still unopened, its weight unchanged, but its meaning altered completely. He did not take it out, not yet. Instead he turned slowly toward the alley, his boots quiet against the damp stone, each step measured, not cautious, but controlled, the same way he had walked into the space, the same way he would walk out. When he reached the edge of the alley, he paused for a moment, not looking back, because there was nothing left to see behind him. Whatever had happened in that courtyard was complete, not finished, but defined, and definition, he knew, was more important than resolution. The city greeted him again without acknowledgement, the distant movement of vehicles, the muted conversations behind closed doors, the quiet rhythm of people surviving within a system too large to fully understand. He stepped onto the street, merging into that rhythm without resistance, just another figure moving through the gray, his posture unchanged, his expression neutral, but something beneath it had shifted, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough to alter how he processed everything around him. He walked 20 yards before stopping at the same street lamp where he had first seen her. The light flickered once, briefly illuminating the empty space where she had passed, and then it steadied again. He reached into his coat and finally took the paper out, holding it in his gloved hand, the edges slightly worn from being folded, the surface marked only by its simplicity, no seal, no identifier, nothing to suggest urgency, and yet everything about it had been designed to create exactly that. He looked at it for a moment, not opening it, not unfolding it, just observing, because now he understood that its contents were secondary. The real message had already been delivered, not through the paper, but through the sequence that had led him to it. He slipped it back into his coat without breaking the fold, the decision deliberate, final for now, and then he checked his watch. 7:31 p.m., 9 minutes since the moment had begun, 9 minutes that had changed the shape of everything without leaving a trace. He lowered his wrist and resumed walking, his pace steady, unremarkable, blending into the flow of the street. A man moving from one point to another with no visible purpose beyond routine, but inside that routine, something had been removed, the impulse to act, to report, to respond immediately, replaced instead by something quieter, something more controlled. He noticed the details now with sharper clarity, the way a shop window reflected movement without revealing it directly, the way a passerby adjusted their path by half a step to avoid contact, the way patterns repeated until they became invisible. And for the first time, he understood how easily something could exist within those patterns without ever being seen. He walked past a group of soldiers standing near a corner, their voices low, their attention divided. None of them looked at him for more than a second, and in that absence of attention, he recognized the same principle she had shown him. Visibility was not about presence, it was about perception, and perception could be guided, shaped, redirected. He continued down the street, the city unfolding around him in its quiet, controlled way, and somewhere within it, she was already gone, not hiding, not escaping, simply continuing the pattern she had created, leaving behind nothing but a question that no report could capture, and a choice he had already made by doing nothing at all. Whitaker kept walking, but the rhythm of his steps had changed, not in speed, not in sound, but in awareness. Every movement now carried a second layer, one that measured not just where he was going, but how he appeared while getting there. The street stretched ahead under dim lights, storefronts darkened, windows reflecting fragments of passing figures that never fully resolved. He passed a narrow cafe, its door slightly open, warm light spilling onto the pavement, voices low inside, ordinary, contained, and for a brief moment he considered stepping in, not out of need, but to observe how easily one could disappear into something so simple. But he kept moving, because tonight was not about blending in, it was about understanding the structure beneath it. He reached an intersection and paused, not abruptly, but naturally, as if considering his direction, though he already knew it. His eyes moved across the space, not searching, but noticing. A man across the street adjusted his coat without reason, a woman slowed her pace just enough to let someone pass, a soldier leaned against a post, appearing relaxed but scanning reflections instead of faces. Small things, quiet things, the kind most people ignored because they did not seem to matter, and yet now they formed a pattern he could not unsee. He resumed walking, turning left, his path unremarkable, his presence unclaimed, and for the first time he understood how a message could move through a city without ever being written down, without ever being spoken aloud, carried instead by timing, by placement, by the absence of attention. He reached into his coat again, feeling the folded paper, still unopened. Still intact, he did not take it out, not here, not where observation could become memory. Instead he adjusted his coat slightly, a small, ordinary gesture that revealed nothing, and continued forward. A patrol passed him heading the opposite direction, their boots louder, their presence more defined. One of them glanced at him briefly, then looked away. No recognition, no question. Just another officer moving through the same controlled space. Whitaker felt the significance of that moment not in what happened, but in what did not. No interruption, no delay, nothing that would mark this night as different from any other, and that absence, that perfect continuity, was the clearest sign that her method worked. He crossed another block, then another, the city repeating itself in quiet variations, and somewhere within that repetition, he began to see how easily intention could hide behind routine, how a single deviation, placed correctly, could pass through unnoticed unless someone was prepared to recognize it. He slowed slightly as he approached a narrow bridge, the metal railing cold under his gloved hand when he rested it there for just a second, not long enough to draw attention, just long enough to feel the structure beneath the surface, solid, unmoving, predictable, and he realized that everything around him functioned the same way, systems built on expectation, maintained by repetition, and disrupted only by those who understood where to apply pressure without leaving a mark. He removed his hand and continued on, the sound of his boots blending into the distant rhythm of the city, and as he moved forward, the question she had left him with did not fade, it sharpened, not demanding an answer, but reshaping how he saw everything that followed, because doing nothing was no longer an absence of action. It was a decision that required more control than anything he had been trained to do, and in that realization, Whitaker understood that the night had not ended in that courtyard. It had only begun, quietly, without witness, without record. Exactly as she intended. Whitaker reached the end of the bridge and slowed, not because he needed to, but because the rhythm of the city had begun to reveal something beneath its surface, something quieter than movement, more deliberate than coincidence. He turned right onto a narrower street. Less traffic, fewer lights, the kind of place where patterns either became clearer or disappeared entirely. The air felt different here, heavier, less disturbed, and as he walked another 20 yards, he noticed it, not a person, not a sound, but a repetition that did not belong. A window on the second floor slightly open despite the cold, curtains unmoving, yet positioned as if recently adjusted. He did not look at it directly, only let it exist at the edge of his awareness, the same way she had taught him without instruction, observe without declaring observation. He continued forward, his pace unchanged, but his attention sharpened, because now he understood that the message had not ended with the paper, it had extended beyond it, into the structure of the city itself. He passed beneath a dim streetlight and paused briefly, not stopping fully, just enough to create a natural break in motion. And in that pause, he became aware of something else, the absence of randomness. Footsteps behind him that matched his pace too precisely, not close enough to be obvious, not distant enough to be irrelevant, just consistent, just controlled. Whitaker resumed walking, not faster, not slower, the same measured rhythm, allowing the distance to remain constant, because confirming a pattern required patience, not reaction. He turned another corner, this time left, into a narrower passage between buildings. And as he did, the footsteps behind him adjusted, not abruptly, but subtly, maintaining alignment. The confirmation settled quietly, without tension. Someone was following him, not aggressively, not carelessly, but with the same discipline he had used earlier, and that realization carried a second layer, deeper, more complex, because it meant the pattern extended beyond her, beyond the courtyard, into something larger, something organized. He reached into his coat again, not for the paper, but for his watch, checking the time without breaking stride. 7:44 p.m. 13 minutes since he had left the street lamp, 13 minutes of uninterrupted continuity. He closed the watch and slipped it back, then adjusted his path slightly, crossing to the opposite side of the passage, a natural movement, nothing abrupt, but enough to test the pattern. The footsteps behind him shifted as well, maintaining distance, maintaining rhythm, confirmation again, quiet, precise. Whitaker felt no urgency, no need to accelerate or confront, because the situation did not call for disruption, it called for understanding. He continued forward until the passage opened into a small square, dimly lit, with a single bench near the center and a narrow fountain that no longer ran. He walked toward it, then stopped, just long enough to rest his hand lightly against the cold stone edge, a simple gesture, ordinary, and in that stillness, the footsteps behind him slowed, then stopped as well, not directly behind, but positioned where they could observe without being seen. Clearly, Whitaker did not turn, did not acknowledge, because acknowledgement would break the structure he was now part of. Instead he remained there for exactly 3 seconds, then pushed away from the stone and resumed walking, leaving the square as quietly as he had entered it, and as he did, he understood something that had not been clear before. The pattern was not linear, it was layered, overlapping movements, overlapping intentions, each one testing, each one observing, and somewhere within that structure, she had placed him not as an endpoint, but as a variable, something to be measured, something to be understood. And as Whitaker moved deeper into the city, the realization settled fully. This was no longer about a message he carried, it was about the fact that he had chosen to carry it without ever unfolding it, and that choice had made him visible in a way no action ever could. Whitaker did not break his pace as he left the square, but the awareness of the presence behind him did not fade. It sharpened, settling into something more precise than suspicion. Something closer to confirmation. The street ahead narrowed again, the buildings pressing closer together, their windows dark, their surfaces reflecting fragments of movement that never fully revealed themselves. He adjusted his stride by less than an inch, a subtle variation, and waited. The footsteps behind him responded, not immediately, not obviously, but enough to confirm discipline, enough to confirm intent. He did not turn, because turning would reduce the situation to something direct, and nothing about this had been direct so far. Instead he continued forward, letting the pattern unfold, because now he understood that this was not about being followed, it was about being observed within a system that expected him to reveal himself through action. He reached another intersection and slowed naturally, glancing briefly toward a shop window, the glass slightly warped, offering a reflection that bent the shapes behind him just enough to obscure detail while preserving movement. And there it was, a figure, indistinct, controlled, maintaining distance with the same precision he had seen before, not the same posture, not the same silhouette, but the same method, the same restraint. Whitaker held the reflection for less than a second, then moved on, because recognition did not require confirmation beyond that, and confirmation, if held too long, became exposure. He crossed the street, his boots quiet, his posture unchanged, just another officer navigating a city that no longer surprised him, and yet everything now felt different, not in appearance, but in structure. He began to see how layers overlapped, how one movement could belong to multiple intentions at once, how a single path could serve more than one purpose depending on who was watching. He reached into his coat again, feeling the folded paper, still there, still untouched, and for the first time, he understood that opening it would not give him control, it would remove it, because the moment he acted on its contents, he would become predictable, and predictability was the only real vulnerability in a system like this. He let his hand fall back to his side, leaving the paper where it was, its presence now symbolic, not informational. He turned right, then continued another 30 yards, passing under a dim light that flickered just enough to disrupt clear visibility, and as he moved through it, the footsteps behind him shifted again, maintaining distance, maintaining rhythm. Never closing, never retreating, just existing within the same controlled space. Whitaker felt no urgency, no need to escape or confront, because escape would confirm fear, and confrontation would confirm awareness. Both were forms of response, and response was exactly what he had chosen to withhold. He reached a longer stretch of empty street and slowed slightly, allowing the distance behind him to compress by a fraction. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to test the boundary. The footsteps adjusted again, not closer, not further, but aligned, and in that alignment, Whitaker understood the final piece. This was not a pursuit, it was a mirror, reflecting his behavior, measuring it, testing whether he would remain consistent, whether he would maintain the discipline she had shown him. He continued forward without deviation, his pace steady, his path unremarkable, and as the city stretched ahead in quiet repetition, he realized that the true message had never been the paper, it had been the structure he was now moving through, a structure that did not demand action, only awareness, and in choosing to do nothing, he had stepped into it completely, not as a target, not as an observer, but as part of the pattern itself. Whitaker continued forward, but now the city no longer felt like a place he was moving through, it felt like something he was moving within, a structure that had already accounted for him, already adjusted to his presence. The footsteps behind him remained, steady, controlled, neither gaining nor falling away, and for the first time, he understood that their purpose was not to close distance, but to maintain it, to exist as a constant, a fixed variable within a moving system. He passed beneath another streetlight, the glow soft, uneven, and as his shadow stretched briefly along the pavement, he noticed something subtle. His own movement no longer felt singular, it felt echoed, not physically, but conceptually, as if every step he took had already been anticipated, already measured against a pattern he had only just begun to understand. He slowed slightly, not enough to signal hesitation, just enough to shift the rhythm by a fraction, and behind him, the response came again, precise, controlled, confirming not just observation, but coordination. Whitaker did not turn, because turning would suggest that he believed this was about the person behind him, and it was not. It was about the system that placed that person there. He reached a wider street, one that opened briefly into a stretch of space with fewer shadows, more visibility, and he stepped into it without pause, allowing himself to be seen in the most ordinary way possible, a man walking with purpose, neither hurried nor slow, and in that visibility, he tested something different, not concealment, but exposure. The footsteps behind him adjusted again, maintaining the same distance, even in the open, even without the cover of narrow alleys or broken light, and that consistency revealed more than concealment ever could. It confirmed discipline beyond individual instinct, something trained, something repeated, something shared. He crossed the street, his boots steady against the pavement, and for a brief moment, he allowed his gaze to lift slightly, not searching, but widening, taking in more of the space around him. The buildings, the windows, the intersections, and in that broader view, he began to see how the pattern extended outward, how it did not rely on a single point or a single person, but on a network of small, controlled actions, each one independent, yet aligned. He reached into his coat again, feeling the folded paper, and this time, he let his fingers rest on it for a moment longer, not as a temptation to open it, but as a reminder of what it represented. Not information, but trust placed under constraint, and constraint, he now understood, was the foundation of everything he was experiencing. He let his hand fall again, leaving the paper untouched, because opening it would not break the system, it would simply remove him from it, and that was not what he had chosen. He turned down another street, quieter again, the light dimmer, the edges less defined, and as he moved deeper into that space, the footsteps behind him remained, unchanged, unwavering, and in that constancy, Whitaker realized something that had not been clear before. The pattern was not testing whether he would act, it was testing whether he could remain consistent without acting, whether he could exist within uncertainty without forcing resolution. He walked another 20 yards, then another, the city repeating itself in quiet, controlled ways, and as the distance behind him held steady, he understood that the moment of decision had already passed, not in the courtyard, not at the street lamp, but in every step since, every choice to maintain rhythm, to avoid reaction, to allow the system to continue without interference, and in that realization, the final shift occurred, not in the city, not in the presence behind him, but in himself, because he was no longer moving through the pattern trying to understand it, he was moving within it, maintaining it, becoming part of it in a way that required no acknowledgement, no confirmation, only the discipline to continue exactly as he was, without deviation, without explanation, and without ever unfolding what he carried. Whitaker did not stop, because stopping would have implied an ending, and nothing about this had ended. The street ahead stretched into the same quiet repetition, dim lights, measured footsteps, windows that reflected more than they revealed, and somewhere behind him, the distance held, unchanged, consistent, no longer a question, no longer something to confirm, just a presence that existed because the pattern required it. He walked another 30 yards, then slowed slightly as he approached a final intersection, wider than the others, open enough to break the rhythm for a moment. He stepped into it without hesitation, crossing at a natural pace, his posture unchanged, his expression neutral, and as he reached the other side, he did not look back, not because he could not, but because he no longer needed to. The system had already shown him everything it intended to show, the rest was not meant to be seen directly, only understood through continuation. He reached into his coat one last time, his fingers finding the folded paper, and for a moment, he held it there, not pulling it out, not unfolding it, just acknowledging its presence, because it was no longer a message waiting to be read, it was a boundary he had chosen not to cross, and that choice had defined everything that followed. He let his hand fall away, leaving it untouched, exactly as it had been from the beginning. The decision now complete, not because it had been resolved, but because it no longer required resolution, he continued walking, his steps steady, unremarkable, blending into the quiet rhythm of the city that had never paused for him and never would, and as he moved forward, something subtle shifted behind him, not in sound, not in movement, but in absence, the footsteps that had matched him for blocks, that had mirrored his pace with exact precision, were no longer there, not fading, not retreating, simply gone, as if they had never existed beyond the moment they were needed. Whitaker did not react, did not slow, because reaction would have broken the final rule he had learned, that recognition did not require acknowledgement. He walked another block, then another, the city unchanged, the pattern intact, and in that continuity, the absence behind him carried more meaning than any presence had before. It meant the observation was complete, the test concluded, the variable no longer needed to be measured. He passed beneath another streetlight, its glow steady, unbroken, and for the first time since the night had begun, there was no adjustment, no response, no alignment to confirm, only his own movement, singular again, yet not the same as before, because now he carried something that could not be seen, not the paper in his coat, but the understanding that had come with it, that the most effective actions were the ones that left no trace, that the strongest signals were the ones that were never acknowledged, and that the most important decisions were often the ones that looked like nothing at all. He continued down the street until the intersection disappeared behind him, until the courtyard, the alley, the street lamp, all of it became part of a past that had no record, no report, no confirmation beyond his own memory, and somewhere within the city, she remained, not hidden, not revealed, simply existing within the same pattern, continuing it without interruption, without recognition, exactly as intended. Whitaker adjusted his coat once, a small, ordinary movement, then kept walking, his pace steady, his presence unremarkable, and as the night closed around him in its quiet, controlled way, the final truth settled without sound. She had not asked him to choose a side, she had asked him to choose whether he could exist without choosing at all, and in doing so, she had shown him something far more dangerous than any information the paper might have contained. She had shown him how to disappear without ever leaving.